Hi, good evening. Thank you all for joining us this evening. It's quite a packed hall, which is great to see. This is the final talk tonight in the Designing Fabrication series. And in putting together the series, we were interested in identifying distinctive international practices that, for us, we felt were redefining the relationship between design and the production of our built environments at the differing scales from furniture to installations, through to architecture and larger scale urban design and infrastructure. I think we had three criteria in putting together our selection of participants. First, we wanted to identify practices that were expanding spatial repertoires to reflect or anticipate emerging tendencies of communication or use within our societies. Secondly, we were interested in being interested in emerging digital design processes and practice. We wanted to eschew those firms that really we felt were pursuing a kind of pure formal exploration of formal novelty, and find practices and bring them to the AA that were addressing a more complex design project of trying to integrate multiple systems to better address the complexities of contemporary society. And finally, we sought out practices that were exploring the convergence of digital design and manufacturing processes to develop expanded models of practice. So we've had a series that has included talks by the principals of SHOP architects, Paul Nogues, Helen and Hard, and last week Nieto Sovigiano. And tonight, I think we're very fortunate to close the series with Nader Tehrani of NADAAA from Boston. Nader is an architect and educator whose work comprehensively addresses these inquiries that I've just outlined, both in his current work and in previous partnership with Monica Ponce de Leon at Office DA. In his own words, his practice is dedicated to the advancement of design innovation, interdisciplinary collaboration, and intensive dialogue with the construction industry. His work has demonstrated a concern with a search for new conditions of materiality and space, and a questioning of the relationship between surface and tectonic detail. Their approach appears to instinctively integrate multiple performance requirements and limits, and many of their projects have involved existing buildings or demanding constraints. It's kind of striking in the work that this often requires a close collaborations with material specialists and manufacturers, and they've often pursued this in suggesting an alternative model of practice. Having studied at Rhode Island School of Design, the AA here, and Harvard, he co-founded Office DA in 1986 and more recently NADAAA in 2010. Over this time, his work has received multiple awards and citations, including 13 Progressive Architecture Awards, awards from the American Academy of Arts and Letters and the Cooper-Hewitt Museum. Their built and unbuilt work, of course, has been published and exhibited internationally. In addition to his practice, Nader is a committed educator, and he is a professor and the head of Department of Architecture at MIT. Prior to this, he's held positions at Harvard, Southern California Institute of Architecture, and the Rhode Island School of Design. His lecture this evening is titled From Office DA to NADAAA, or DADA and NADAAA, and will address his development through two modes of architectural production, from configurative to figurative practices, demonstrated through installations, built and unbuilt projects. So please join me in giving Nader a warm welcome.
Thank you for your kind introduction. The work of tonight is essentially new work, so I've never presented it before. But embedded in there is some connections between some of the research and older works I had done, both in collaboration with students and partly with Monica, some of them. But I think they're important stepping stones for the discussion tonight. The new work also I think, is being done under extreme conditions. First, they're a different scale. So the shifts of economy from a block to a slat of wood to the larger building involve a whole different range of issues. The shift in time zones essentially means that you no longer have the immediate relationship with the work of architecture. There's a kind of deference and a collaboration that is usually across the Pacific or the Atlantic. And dealing with different cultural differences also contributes to a new way of conceptualizing the work of architecture. But certain themes remain present and are the subject of the lecture tonight. I would say that within our work there are two modes of tectonic development. One is aggregative, in the robust sense of the word, in the traditional sense of the word, where there's an identifiable relationship between the part and the whole, and the seaming together of materials is identifiable. The means and methods of construction, which is really the center of our early research, is part of its focus, and in fact what makes projects such as the Hookaden in Mantra achievable. This is actually the working drawing, because the plan and section could have done nothing for you here. This is to scale almost, and this is the drawing that we would have to paste onto the ceiling in order to do the plumb bobs to achieve that. Of course, there is a relationship here between the unit of construction and the perception of smoothness, which is the other mode of tectonic behavior that is more readily identifiable in the Weston house. Coming at the tail end of postmodernism and other movements such as deconstruction, all of our early works were also invested in a critique of those very platforms that used either typology or the figurative clarity of units that in combination with each other would challenge composition. Here there is instead an emphasis on establishing and developing difference through sameness. The corrugation conceals its seams, but rigid on one axis and malleable on the other, it produces structural and spatial possibilities such that when it's unfolded as a ruled surface, it can produce an awning that produces a mediating space between the living room and the garden through the insertion of a stair. It also reminds us that architecture is not like illustration. It's not a pictorial craft. The architectural drawing is always already an act of construction. You construct a drawing, you don't draw a picture. And so, with these two examples in mind, there is a ghost of certain modes of thinking that architecture really is the result of a series of preconditions, material conditions, detail conditions that produce then the thickness of a plot that produces the syntax of a building, how you turn a corner, how you punch openings, how you create screens. All of this is part and parcel to the genetic makeup, in this case, of corrugation. In China, and so I'll constantly go back and forward. Now we're in the present again. The kind of diagram of aggregations in this case has been moderated by the possibility of subtractions. You stack brick on top of each other, but you can also essentially shave away brick. And so in dealing with a project that is stubbornly repetitive, we were commissioned to do an office complex on a site that is to be populated by a range of other office buildings. The zoning and guidelines of this project was predetermined for all of us. So much so that we had a menu of cubes, essentially, to select from, all of which come with a predetermined core, and with a certain level of leniency, if you like, a parametric leniency, to reestablish relationships between them. Located in Ordos, a controversial place, we don't know whether it's real or fictional, whether these projects happen or not. It is slated to be broken ground in a month or so, but essentially the entire fiction of this project is based on an economy of coal, which is fueling all of the urbanism of that area. What we offer in this project then are two really strong arguments, I would say, at the urban scale. One is the notion that after the reorientation of all of these buildings, the composition of which I will explain in a second, that there is still a public and private realm, and that there's an importance on creating a public realm for the pedestrians. The notion that the base of the building still has a responsibility to certain programmatic possibilities and the idea of congregation and bringing the public together. On the other side, it is a reminder that all buildings, thank you, today anyway, have a commitment to and to vehicular access. And so the real question then of this project is, how do you acknowledge both the vehicular access as the front door and the pedestrian, and reconcile what is traditionally made subservient to one or the other? The precise nature of the way in which the composition of the volumes come together, to some degree, is the result of a tactical idea that we have, but something that also has a fundamental real estate propositions. Rooted in the premise that by touching each other, one can expand the space more flexibly, rooted in a history of composition that suggests certain spatial possibilities when pitted against each other, the intersection of two cubes produces a space that when excavated on the outside and on the inside produces a kind of urbanism. An urbanism that connects the two buildings together, but also urban spaces from one side to the other. The history of this compositional strategy is well documented and has many other renditions of this, going from Kahn to Stirling, Machado, Silvetti, and further. But it gives us an insight into the kinds of strategies that we could adopt and, in fact, tested out in all of these office models. But essentially, it gave us a syntax with which to work. In other words, if you carve the base, you can create an entry. If you carve the intersection of two, you create an archway. If you carve the top, it's a skylight. If you carve the base, you connect to the basement. All of these produce conditions that are alien to the Platonic purity of the original volume, but they produce important civic thresholds into the project and activate the spaces from all sides of the city, bringing everybody into this kind of star-shaped urban configuration in the center. The connection then, the promise of this project is that it is not an office park. It is actually a space between another urban condition outside of the site, which we have yet to see. The skylight, I need not say more, is a way of connecting the building to the sun. The idea that part of this office complex is not about the stacking of spaces, but about the excavation of spaces where collective entities come together to collaborate in alternative ways of working. And of course, in the basement, the idea that the parking has an articulated threshold with the rest of the plaza, bringing essentially the underworld and the overworld together. The urban configuration then takes the maximum amount of real estate, taking away one, connecting each and every one of them to produce a real estate proposition whereby each of these can operate autonomously or all together, depending on the shift of economies that occur over the ages. Remember, we're in a time of economic volatility right now, and the kinds of things we planned for 2-3 years ago are simply not the same as how they would be sold, rented, or operated in today's market, such that any of these kinds of configurations may be deemed possible based on people wanting to all be in one building or on one floor plate throughout the buildings. Then, from the perspective of tectonics and fabrication, one can also begin to identify the unit of construction as a precast unit of concrete that establishes a rapport with an opening, essentially as a singular and tolerant unit that can even be built badly. In this case, it's rendered flush, but we were interested to see what would happen if we maximized the tolerance so that the maximum amount of mistakes can be made, and it would then reinforce the aesthetic of the building. Within that context, we took on the morphological conditions of the very buildings, casting the concrete, excavating out of them so that precisely they do not align with their neighbors. As the building gets expanded, it produces a more modeled surface that produces depth in the surface, from which larger scale excavations, the skylights that you already saw, may be punched. The intersection of the two, requiring urbanistic connections at the base, what you've already seen, and essentially something that brings together some dialogue between the part and the whole. This, in many ways, is a classic project of ours, produced this year, but in a way in the mindset of the kind of work that I was doing some 15, 20 years ago. I mean, the kind of thinking that goes into this is really quite elemental, but it's with an eye towards what you can get away with when limited to the absolute minimum of spatial freedom in terms of tectonic freedom and a restriction on craft. Implicit within our work also is a critique of other tendencies, other advances made in technology over the last 20 years. Always being fascinated by the kind of digital work done by people like Gary. In his case, the effort was not actually in the digitization, but rather in a kind of belief in composition, something that divorces the relationship between space and surface with absolutely any disregard to syntax. So the turning of corners, the coping of buildings, the relationship between geometry and unit is always absent in that work. Much of our work, instead, is dedicated to the yield that is able to be produced between the unit and its performance at the overall level. In Casa La Roca, we developed essentially parametric variations in the block and the brick systems that perform optically, that perform structurally, and that perform environmentally. All of this as a strategy to, again, develop a figurative strategy that is always in tension with the various contingencies that architecture has to respond to. The folding of this wall, giving it the lateral stability, much like Jefferson's serpentine wall, is laid on the diagonal precisely so that it can be corbelled and produce a ruled surface with a depth of about 2 feet to give it the kind of stability that it requires. But also, it's the identification that what is important in this project is not the brick. It's actually the negative space produced by the mortar. The idea that you can take 3/8 of an inch and expand it to produce a variable bond such that you can get open bonding systems and absolute closed bonding systems on the other end produces the possibility of a wall that is at once a curtain wall and a structural wall as a seamless surface. These projects, Casa La Roca, among a range of other ones in the same family, produced in us an interest in structural topologies. Why? Because we always understood in our minds a commitment to functional typologies against which they had to wrestle. And I'm not going to present this project in full, but it's a stepping stone to other things we did. A huge urban project in Kuwait with a stadium in it, with a mall, souks, with long span structures, and with auditoria. All of these typologies involved different and contradictory geometries that required mediation. So whereas each program was static in its shape, much like the staticness of this room, as you can see in the upper images, the flow of geometric coffering was smoothed out in the overall coffered ceiling of the piece. In this sense, the same way the Flemish bond was made to be variable in Casa La Roca, here circles become hexagons to produce the relationship of the stadium coffering. The hexagon gets compressed into a running bond to produce the structural conditions for the pylons. The realignment of the running bond pattern with the grid produces the structural system that gauges the square rooms of the mall. And finally, the triangulation that is imparted by the coffering gives you the rake that the theaters need for the cinema. In other words, the topological system is made to align with the fixed typologies that rest underneath them. Of course, the irony of this project is that first it won, but then coming to build it at the cusp of the economic fall was a contradiction. The idea that it's more economical to make this prefabricated in steel and then ship it to the site, but they don't build in steel in Kuwait. But to build it in concrete means you have to mass customize all of the formwork from one piece to the other, which essentially means that you have to build the entire building twice. And because of that, we set out to build an installation of it, if you like, a mock-up of it, beginning to develop a single unit that has the ability to migrate multiple geometries. Here, a familiar trope by now, this is 10 years old, but by now it's been tested many times, the Voronoi pattern becomes the basis by which a single unit may negotiate multiple geometries. Here, an extruded wall, an archway, a dome, all of these conditions here, not as a structural surface as in Casa La Roca, but a 2.5 dimensional surface. The extrusion produces a coffering that is meant to be structural. Of course, what's more important about this project is the fact that the structure failed. You can even see it failing here right under your eyes. Why? Because the coffering coming down is not structural that way. So we had to build it again, this time in China, testing out its both compressive and tensile possibilities through an installation that's a figure 8, one side a dome, the other side a dish. And by extending the logic of a traditional keystone that would have been there to the bottom of the piece, you get to essentially distribute the weight of the piece right down into the foundation. The investment in structural research has been an important one. Even more important for me because I was never able to pass the structural exam for the architectural registration. Concurrent with some of my work on this research, I did happen to visit Japan and was fascinated by Ito's Tods, which coincided also with a competition that we had in Beirut competing against Zaha Hadid. Our theory was that the competition was rigged because there was Zaha there and then 4 or 5 little insignificant firms underneath her. That was her alma mater, and we said, well, this is perfect. We actually get to research something because we're certain we're going to lose anyway. So this is a moment where we can actually take on Tods because of our own interest without worrying about winning or losing. Now, why I love Tods, of course, at initial glance, is that it establishes both a figurative and allegedly a configurative relationship with the very trees, the nature in front of it on the boulevard. Once I studied the building and went inside it, I understood that in fact it's a very normative commercial or modern typology of stacked slabs with an absolute indifference to the very structural conditions that it portrays on the outside. It falls into a classic trap of the dichotomy between the duck and the decorated shed. Here the structure is not called on to do anything beyond its proposition as a sign. In the Beirut site, we had the opportunity to build the building not merely in the campus, but actually in a forest within the campus. If traditionally the context of architecture is of the urbanism of the city, is the history of architecture, is the morphology of building types, here's the moment where our building was to be placed behind a row of palms, cedar, and ficus trees in the density of this natural condition. So here's a condition with which, with all of our allegiances to the configurative properties of units, we knew that at all cost that we wanted our building to disappear. So we knew the answer to the proposition before we even started designing. But the question then became, how do we do it? Similar to the Villa Moda project, we established a geometry and a parity between how a triangle, once truncated, produces a hexagon, which produces a columnar condition, expanded a pilotis, or made perpendicular a transfer beam, or a mere wall. In other words, all of the basic architectural conditions of structure can be achieved by the variation of these two geometries. And given the orientations in which we wanted the program to take, orienting towards the Mediterranean, to the campus buildings, we knew that we would end up misaligning some things at some point or the other. In turn, gravity works such that the weight is at the bottom and it lightens up at the very top, meaning that the transfer beams usually go somewhere in the middle. So that unit of geometry has some other relationship to a larger morphological proposition. What was interesting to us also was the way in which Beirut is operating within a multicultural historical framework, drawing from the vicissitudes of structural conditions in Venice, being translated in the Beiruti context, re-theorized in Paris, and then recast here on this site, using the floors and the beams not as a trabeated condition, but as really as tensile and compressive slabs, all of which work with each other dynamically in relationship to the spanning and programming forces. So when you double span, the slab gets thickened. As you cantilever, again, similarly, the cantilever gets thickened. For the auditorium, the rake of the structure changes, and as you go to the offices at the top, it lightens up. the entire building essentially, spatially, not just at the level of the surface, becomes essentially a modeling of the structural programming of a very small site plan, which has a core running up one side, but essentially a spiral promenade that connects all of the disparate programs together, orienting it to all of the sides of Beirut. In turn, the structure is not in the service of the building, it is a protagonist to the building. It is its main voice, and here just a view of the library of that project begins to show the way in which the structure is really the main voice and the agent that essentially establishes a dialogue between structure and skin. Here, structure and skin, though rendered differently, are not opposed to each other. They become somehow embedded as part of the same field. We've always been interested in the relationship between figures and configurations. Figures are things like predetermined a priori forms. The telephone booth is a figure. The shape of a bottle is a figure. A human being with arms, head, legs, figure. A basilica is an architectural figure. A rotunda is an architectural figure. Often we inherit typologies and figures that then we have to stuff with program. And then the question becomes, how is it that one establishes a meaningful relationship between the inside and the outside? The image on the wall here is a commonplace image from the United States in the 1950s, whereby American football players would try to get the maximum amount of males in one of these, and whoever would get the most would presumably, beyond the pleasure of being in there, get an award of some sort. The alternative to figurative practices produces other kinds of games where systems are given primacy. If anybody's played Twister, you understand that before you're allowed to achieve anything, you need to develop the systems that get you there. The grid of dots is really what determines and gives structure to this game. Then depending on how you roll the dice, you essentially get the different kind of figures that are the result of the matrix of rules that this produces. These two, if you like, architectural cultures are not mutually exclusive. You are always somehow combating one force with the other. And in fact, the Beirut project is really the result of this kind of tension. But all architectural projects somehow are embedded with this problematic, with all due respect to both. Our practice is obviously invested in the configurative. We don't even begin design without thinking about the detail up front. In this case, though, and I'm not going to show both designs. I should have had the first scheme. Invited to the Guangzhou Biennale, we developed at first a tensegrity structure, and anybody who's designed tensegrities knows that there's a radically strict relationship between the compressive and tensile members, and beyond a certain geometry, they yield, they just fall apart. Unable to craft with exactitude those kinds of things on budget in the matter of a month that the Biennale was supposed to go up, we had to develop a completely opposite way of conceiving of this project. So it was figurative in nature. The trees on the site could not be hurt, so we had to work around that. We had to maximize the site of the installation. So the question was, how close could we get to the curb, and how much could we get around the corner and close to the buildings? That set us up with some constraints or parameters where we could flex the size of this installation. Had we built it on the ground, then nobody could go around. So we knew already that this would be a cloud overhead. The question then became, how do we develop a tectonic that was absolutely tolerant of any mistake, and then essentially work in relationship with the maximum densities required for compressive, tensile, and other loads purely by the aggregation of arbitrarily placed welded elements. All the while imagining that a figure could then be melded seamlessly back down to certain trunks that establish orientations for these units with the minimum amount of density that is absolutely required to give it the maximum amount of rigidity. So in a way, if you like, this is we would want this installation to be a structural diagram of the maximum moments, stresses, and strains of a structural system. And then, of course, the design doesn't go into this. The design goes into the formwork that is a framework for the contractor to operate from. All of this, of course, is drawn and meticulously scripted in our office, knowing fully well it won't be built at all like what we're drawing it. Essentially a hypostyle hall. Besides the whole of the trees, we inserted a third oculus to essentially frame a view of the sky and establish a relationship with the context. The contractor of this is a builder who specializes in steel doorknobs. We had designed a large family of doorknobs for him of many, many types. And these steel bars that you're looking at are really those vertical door handles. So there's hundreds of door handles here that are putting this together. The argument about figuration and configuration is also rather simple at the end. Whether you're casting a bowl out of concrete or building it up out of strands of grass, they are part and parcel of a similar equation. The aggregates here honed down, grinded down to their bare microscopic dimensions, and here the articulation of the units of construction essentially being identifiable. The bigger question for us is, well, what happens to our practice when we don't do this? What happens when we do this? And so I'll try to expand on that in a second also. At the heart of this discussion is also a question of figuration and representation. The question of also how is it that geometry yields certain architectural potentials. What I like about the snake is that at one level the figure of the snake is the result of the egg that it has swallowed. But what permits that to happen is the curious geometry of, if you like, the skin, the shingling system, which is a precondition for its expandability. And many of our projects then establish this tight programmatic relationship between function, form, and figure. This is a project that has absolutely no fat. It's been liposuctioned of all of its possible excesses. A small house, the master bedroom has been separated from the kids' bedrooms, producing a diagonal that links to the landscape, has a family room that looks towards the west, and a living room that then looks out towards the northern woods. Everything in this project is shrink-wrapped in the way that the egg is being shrink-wrapped with the skin of the snake. There's just enough headroom to get into that stair and then come out of it to go back into the rest of the bedrooms and bathrooms and the fireplace. you'll note that the figure of the building is literally the sink, the tub, the toilet, the fireplace. There is no representation, if you like. There is no form outside the very things that are being hugged. Along the path, the systems of American construction, the sheet materials, copper, plywood, plaster, become a vehicle of expression and articulation along the narrative, the path, the promenade that takes you up the stair as a piece of furniture towards the light and essentially the living room that looks out over the woods. Looking back, then, we realize that the stair has a curious relationship with its architecture. At once, it is an insertion in it, but it's also delaminated from it. It is grafted into that promenade. But it's also the element that gives the building its most key expression. With all of the rules, the regulations, and the ethics that go into construction, the notion, for instance, that the shiplap can only be excavated from the space of the reveal to bring light into the office, the idea that even the door handles into the garage are a delamination of the very board and batten system that is instilled in this structure, in this barn structure, that not everything can follow its rule. In fact, the main figurative thrust of this building is this anomaly, an exception to the system. The laceration of the ramp and stair really are what produces the iconic condition of this building. It also bears into mind the kind of semantic predicaments that were brought up and were in vogue in the 70s and 80s about the slippery relationship between the signifier and the signified in the construction of meaning. The excerpt, more rather, of The Little Prince that identifies at once the hat and the snake having engulfed the elephant is a classic moment where meaning is not fixed. It's actually deferred and extended and proliferated as part of the agenda, in this case, of architecture. So now we zoom back again to the present in a project that is dedicated to the magnification of what in Korean culture is called model home galleries. These are all model home galleries by famous architects. I think this is Ben van Berkel. I don't remember the names of these architects, but model home galleries is essentially a structure that is built with, at the base, usually auditoria, exhibit spaces, cafes, restaurants, and so forth, all of them very public. They're built in local neighborhoods and communities, but they're really broadcasting in a black box above all of the model homes that will be built in up to 40, 50, 100 apartment towers. This is not a unit that's on the construction site. This is mass housing for the middle and upper classes. And thus, the investment in a piece of architecture is at the level that we would here in the West think of as a museum. They are civic structures, and a way of getting buy-in to build them is to give them public amenities. Typologically speaking, one could imagine them to really reduce it to its bare functioning components is really the black box above and a public hall at the base. The potential of the base, of course, is its transparency, to yield maximum relationship between the city, the sidewalk, the parks, and the public to come in. The black box then essentially, in this context, is its iconic properties. It has absolutely no performance. There are no windows in it, maybe a symbolic window here or there, but its yield is in the fact that it cannot be that. It has to be something spectacular. So where do you get the spectacle from? especially located on a site somewhere in the middle of nowhere, rapidly urbanizing, but in need of shape. We did exactly that. We put a big dumb box on top of a transparent base. That was the start of the thing. We extended the logic by imagining a hypostyle hall that incorporates the program, but essentially lifts the building up. We don't care what happens up above, but essentially maximizes the open relationship to the street, but bringing the building down from the top, hanging the hat from above, such that the hypostyle hall, in a way, is an expression of what is being draped down from the program above. The skylights, the stairs, the columns, all are, in a way, tectonic inversions. They come from the sky down, not from the floor up. Of course, all of the systems of the building are also held up here. So the coordination of lighting, fire safety, illumination, all of that is held up in that space also. But the program is not insignificant. Somewhere in this hypostyle hall, there's major auditoria, there's VIP rooms, there's cores. So the expression of this hypostyle hall is then tamed by the importance of adding other programs around which the public is to use as exhibition space, cafe, connection to the park, and so forth, with a kind of extension between the auditorium and the main space. What we try to do then is to radicalize the porosity of each of these types individually. The auditorium, once the events end inside, literally the proscenium lifts up to create a connection to the outside, and when there's other connections, the stage is in the center with the public outside looking into the auditorium. The logic of its morphology is that it hangs down, as I said before, and that the very systems that we're interested in are all somehow stitched into the ceiling as it comes into the walls. The expression of openings into service areas are really minimized and muted as part of a more robust public strategy. The agenda then of the edge is such that both structure and skin are somehow coalesced into each other. Whether mullion, window frame, or I-beam, everything is reduced to the bare minimum of T's, almost becoming a bar-coded expression and almost eliminating the weight of the building expressed on the inside as a sheer sheet of glass that then performs in different ways in the north and in the south as fritting, mullions, and structural systems are all somehow delineated on this glazed surface with the opposite, a horizontal expression on the top that is the way in which the black box on top is meant to disappear. The logic, the morphological logic of the black box is very simple. Out of a very simple cube, the same truncation of china comes in here to resuscitate this form and essentially yield what appears to be an anomalous shape that frames that object. But essentially, it's a still life strategy. It's a table with an object on top of it. From all sides, then, the urbanism is then activated. On one side, the corner is thrust to activate the northern side, the connection to the park. On the opposite side, the base of the building then has a responsibility, if you like, to speak in relationship to the landscape and the program it serves. There are areas of the base that are 2 stories. There are areas that do not require that, and the rest is done with drainage. The systems that are then designed to annihilate, if you like, abstract and silence architecture. Really, the agenda here is to find a way of barcoding both the base and the top such that the signifier is reduced to its bare matter, if you like. the horizontal and the vertical systems are exacerbated in their functions and in their perceptions, in their phenomena. Constantly working with the sun, the structural systems, the anomalies, the base is somehow modeled. The louvers that conceal the top essentially land on top of this. And in those instances where there are windows, a slight alteration is then brought out to address a larger public. The agenda here then is, of course, to play the game without playing the game in the same way that is played by others. I'm a firm believer that if you want to be a good architect, you should know nothing about construction. So the idea that I'm holding a saw here is a complete fraud. But I realized also that the agenda of going to the site reveals much, because the means and methods of fabrication are extraordinary, and the way they do things in Korea are fundamentally different than the way that we're used to doing them in America. And oddly enough, what takes 24 months to do in Boston may take only 4 months to do there. And so the notion that we can go there and learn from them is extraordinary, because the building industry is not calcified, it is not stubborn, it in fact yields a great potential that other places would not. Now, on the road to structural investigations, I've come across many typologies that are seductive in many ways. But as pure structure, they're not interesting to me. In their architectural potential, they become constantly interesting. Why is it that we have a clear understanding of vector active structures, form active structures, and surface active structures, but in architectural terms, we're never able to link these together? It's inconceivable. In nature, we're quite comfortable with the idea that water and snow and ice and steam are all essentially the same thing undergoing different changes of state. What would it mean to use geometry as a mechanism to alter the state of a structural condition from one condition to an absolute other? That became the basis for our investigations and the development of a new unit of construction. In other words, for that to happen, you can't have a brick, you can't have a sheet of glass. You have to develop something that parametrically, once altered on the X, Y, and Z axis, can achieve different structural states as it migrates from one side to the other side of an installation. This is in collaboration with Georgia Tech students. And as we did the different geometric permutations, we realized that shifts in scale enable different architectural possibilities, from a two-pronged condition to 4 to 8, and essentially are able to produce an architecture that is seamless in its whole, but divisible into a stacked masonry system here, a laterally braced wall here, a spanning truss here, about 30, 40 feet, and a cantilever of another 10 feet. All of these composed of and made of the same essential unit, a box beam that is then able to distribute itself in different compositions with a radial symmetry as it goes around. The stacked system at the bottom. Here, essentially, you're seeing a riff on the Venezuela wall. The spanning member that goes from a vertically organized 6-base structure here, all of this mass are those very units rotating to a horizontal condition as they hit the next beam overhead here. So in fact, what appears as a plethora of undescribable mass is in fact a unitary rotation of every unit as it goes from a vertical to horizontal condition, and then finally from the beam here, cantilevers out as each of those units ingests another structure to reinforce its cantilevering span. The sophistication of what structure can do in a pure state in that installation was insufficient. So for me, the question then became, how is it that we can invest in a programmatic condition within which is an embedded and intrinsic structural property without which the architecture would not be the same? Located on a site in southern France on the side of a hill, we were to design an ambitious house for a family that at once wants to take advantage of the views, the panoramic views, if you like, on one side of the building, but with a deep sense of interiority that requires a courtyard on the center, but not forgetting that the top of the property, the uphill side, has discrete and important views, all while protecting them from neighbors, which are in fact quite close to the structure. The geometric mutation of this building produces spatial conditions that are both interior and exterior at the same time, and produce spatial possibilities that are unprecedented in some senses. Generically conceived of as a cube, rotated to accommodate for the shape of the site, the parallelogram then maximizes the views on one side but makes them discretized on the other. The stepping down of the bottom side of the hill gives the top leg a view over the bottom leg. In turn, the articulation and the opening up of the roof clips over here gives views to the uphill side. And then the discovery that the slippage between the two produces a civic opening that connects the public space, essentially the entry here, to the interior conditions of that courtyard. The base of the building then is actually quite conventional, though realigned programmatically such that it works not like a house but like a dormitory. Striated with a series of parallel walls, the family room extends out into the landscape, but the rooms are essentially alternated with party walls, all of the toilets of which are brought out into the public realm so that they can be used in different dormitory-style configurations. The corridor is not a circulation space, it becomes a public space of the house. The upper leg of the house then is articulated with two stairs connecting to the bottom floor on the ends. The main entry, the formal entry if you like, is up there, and the arched opening down here coming up with the main living leg here with kitchen, and then the master suite here. The critical part of this project then always comes back to that line. The swimming pool's retaining wall is the very same structural wall that brings together the figure of this house. The promenade going up and into the private domain essentially frames the very wall without which this structure could not happen. Extending out and beyond and up into the building to the pinnacle, the cantilever of this project is really what produces the monolithic conditions of the framing of the house. On the one edge of the building, the bedrooms are all glazed and then give way to the staircase that produces the bottom side of the cantilever. 15 feet beyond that, the edge of that wall comes into the master suite such that you have to walk through the beam from one side of the suite to the other, and then connects back to the arch that goes into the building. The main entry then blocks the view of the Mediterranean beyond, only to frame it upon access to the oblique conditions of the site, producing a very open condition, almost seamless in its glass, but completely protected from the house right behind it. And of course, opening up to the Pinus Pinei on the opposite side. Traditionally, all houses look downhill. This house is also taking advantage of the structural figuration of its roof in order to establish a prime relationship, not only with the horizon beyond, but also the discrete relationships with the terraces on the upside of the building. Essentially, in this case, it means you're not only spanning from this pillar to this pillar, you're also spanning from that pillar to that pillar. And this is a kind of surface active shell that is vaulting in two ways. The backside of the house then is multivalent in its orientations and takes advantage of views in very discrete ways, while the bottom side is invested in this way in which the dormitory works. The building is conceived of as a piece of infrastructure, a concrete highway system pouring of brute concrete. It could almost be raw, and with a secondary level of craft to the terracotta tiling, which is common to the area, with a third level of craft, if you like, in the woodwork, which is more tactile in nature. The terracing material from the outside comes inside. As it comes through the bedrooms, it extends inside and even to the corridor, such that the expression of the corridor is a discrete extrusion of both bedrooms coming in from one side and bathrooms coming in from the other side. The bathrooms then have a discrete relationship with the pool. In fact, the pool conceptually spills into those bathrooms. The oculi frame the view of the people inside the pool, but the tiling of the pool essentially comes inside and occupies that space. The retaining wall is essentially the wall that is shared by both and also brings light into the homework space of the kids. The bathrooms get the light of the swimming pool and essentially are symbolically connected to both sides as well. The building then differs from its neighbors essentially by operating under a premise of stealth, a robust piece of architecture, but at the same time invested in the agricultural rejuvenation of the site. In fact, the clients have a very healthy and robust idea about all of the different species of nature and fruit trees that can become to populate the entire site. The landscape strategy is not an accident. It is, in fact, very much part of the idea of embedding something within the terrain and extending the agricultural logic it once had into the near future. It is a curious thing that the ground in architecture has become the object of much inquiry in recent history. Our projects have attempted, on the other hand, not only to articulate that possibility of building the ground, but also differentiating between what is the ground and what is the sky. The domes never had the responsibility of inhabiting people. They could bring in light, they could span, they could do many things, but the ground and the sky are different. It's important to note that the ground, again, is radically stubborn. It can't do many things. The dome can do many things. But the dome, let us not be fooled, is not a thing. It is more often than not two things. The dome that you see on the outside differs from the dome on the inside, as the dome on the interior has much to do with the representations of the heavens above, while the icon from the outside is really about the civic mission of the building within the city. This, in turn, translates into many things in contemporary terms, but it also underlines the tensions that I brought up before about the relationship between the figures and configurations of architectures. There are contemporary architectures that are spectacular on the outside, but are totally indifferent to the very organizations on the inside. In other words, this is a work of taxidermy. There is no tension between the inner and outer dome here. This is like stuffing a sausage. Other people have had more interesting recursions into speculations about the ground and the dome. And Jussieu is one of those examples. And the figuration of the ground is one of those moments where the dichotomy between figuration and configuration have been blurred. Here, the field is the figure, and the figure is the field. But only 1% of architecture is allowed to do that. The world that you and I live in is a very stubborn world. The last chapter in this presentation is really about this division between the ground and the sky, and a series of early investigations, almost when I had recently graduated, took me to outside of the architectural field to look at the sartorial trade and discover the relationship between pleating and fabrication, between darting and fabrication, and that the act of geometry in the dart is essentially what gives not a compound curve, it is actually a ruled surface, but a curvature to the surface. And that in turn can produce the exact conditions of a bowstring truss, an arch, and a wrapper for the column. This is an installation at the GST, but that got me to thinking about what is it, how is it that we could actually program this thing, because effectively this is doing nothing different than those slats that you see above. The syntax of this, of course, is well charted by now. It's a radial symmetry that connects them all. The darts can be seen, are made visible within the syntax, but essentially it's a standard unit, but mass customized. The world that you and I live in, for better or for worse, is made up of this. Pipes above, with hung ceilings concealing them. Floorboards below with all of the mechanical and computer system wirings below them. This is the shit that we have to contend with. Any architecture that we have to deal with in this day and age, more often than not, is dealing with sprinkler systems, diffusers, lighting. And if you can control that, the chances are you may have controlled 70% of your problem. In this case, and this is a project that is a kind of response to the Villa Moda project, Bank Restaurant, we knew, needed a flexible ground because precisely restaurants are reconfigured on an hourly, sometimes daily basis to accommodate for twosomes, foursomes, and huge parties. But all of the services, the structural systems, the mechanical systems, the wiring, everything else is brought from above in this case. So much so that we even suspended the wine room from that side to underline the idea that symbolically this restaurant can do more from above than below. The seating then is irrelevant because it's really the stacking of plywood in relationship to the existing structural system that gives body and form to this project, with each sheet of plywood acting like a theatrical proscenium, producing the seamless surface of an entire project, all of which elusively are containing and bending and occupying and being programmed by the very contents just behind it. It is very much like a theater. In other words, you can actually see everything within the seams and the cuts, but the representation of continuity is maintained on the perpendicular axis. The School of Architecture at Georgia Tech was another one of these opportunities, albeit with a totally different kind of tectonics. This was an architecture not of ours, and this was no occasion in which we would then further aggrandize our authorship. This is the building of Heffernan. And so the question was how we could play judo with it, work with its power, work with its structural system, and extend its logic into the present. The real question of this project was, what do you do with a high bay, given that the School of Architecture needed much more program that it could already house? Our mission really was to figure out, well, you need a flexible grounds, so where can you put the program? Invariably, it led to a strategy of suspending architectures within, a series of chandeliers, if you like, that articulate the argument of the building. The building, and the building has many components, of course, I'm going to only focus on the high bay, is a floor. And the floor is, in fact, raised to house all of the computer material, but the notion is that this desk can be moved around in any configuration on that grid so that huge installations can be built on the inside, but also studios can reconfigure themselves in accordance with pleasure. The program then is suspended from the existing crane above and never touching the ground except for one spot where the staircase completes another urban promenade that connects east and west side of the campus. The idea of the building then really is about how do you activate that truss to do the most for you by suspending everything from within it. The major and biggest piece of program was really the visiting critics studio that is literally suspended on the crane and repurposes it, never touching the walls and only touching the floor in one point. This is a construction shot with the delicacy of each of the tensile members that, in a way, connect to the bowed T-sections underneath here. The spiral stair that is part of the promenade that connects and links back to this stair and goes through the building, activating both the north and the south wing. The spiral stair is conceptually suspended off of the truss and shrink-wrapped and not touching the ground, really using a piece of millwork to mediate between the ground and the stair, with its mesh being a kind of sock, a tensile instrument that shrink wraps the forms and the functions of the railings. And finally, the suspended light fixtures that are designed to retract up so that one can actually build huge structures within the space. And finally, a retractable wall that opens up onto a crit room and a fabrication room beyond. That is part of the narrative of suspension. This entire thing then is really about grafting ourselves into the logic of Heffernan. In a way, the insertions are quasi-embedded, clearly not part of his authorship, but at the same time, an extension of its logic. Ironically, the building, the original building, was a research building. They invented many technologies in them, among them the technology of the rotary of helicopters. Huge helicopters would be pinned down to the ground of the high bay with maximum speed going in there. And all we needed to do was to put a patina on the R's of the research to identify the arc of architecture. I end then with the architecture school in Melbourne, located at the heart of campus between two major public spaces. We introduce a new concept for a studio hall, a new urban space contained within the inner core of a new building, bringing in other disciplines in a space of education that proposes different ways of bringing different faculties together. a huge figure that's lodged in there and then framed by a series of proscenia that connect it to the Elizabeth Murdoch building on one side and the Student Center on the other. The notion here is that this school of architecture becomes a new magnet for all of the activities that happen within the campus. The actual programs that happen within the edges of the building, if you like, are rather benign and specific. But the way in which the main hall is activated by the insertion of new studios becomes critical to the way that it works. The ground is activated by a new experimental studio that's built up literally out of the ground, extending lockers to frame a structure. The structure is enclosed so it can be used as alternative and open classroom scenarios. The corbelling of its sides introduce windows to the first floor, giving bias to one side over the other. The lockers essentially become a post office for everybody and a connection to the second floor, really activating the space at the ground. Literally, it's the ground growing up to become one of the visiting critic studios that is housed underneath here. The roof of the building is really a coffered system that brings southern light into it. Remember, that's Australia, so it's northern light for us. The figuration of the coffering of the roof modulates the way that the light comes in, but also is the very structural system from which the entire enterprise is suspended. Two other studios activate that space and in a way reinterpret the coffering system, only touching the balconies at one point each. The coffering system is literally suspended as an extension of the illumination system above. And finally, its relationship to the student center and what's called the concrete lawn. The Joseph Reed facade is a fictional device. They brought this building from downtown Melbourne to this space without a building behind it. And now we're struck buttressing this building up, needing to put a new face onto it and making it really an extension of our building. Much like the other two installations, we extend the logic of this architecture and erect a new structure out of it and connect it back into the building using another studio auditorium space as a focal point from which to radiate optical views back out into the concrete lawn. The ending of this lecture is a little bit more messy because it's the binding of two theories that I've been working on for some time now and needs a better reconciliation, but that the argument I'm proposing involves two different histories and theories that have rarely been brought together in practices. On the one hand, it is an investment in an architecture of organicism and classicism, where there's an investment between the parts and the whole. But at the same time, it needs to recognize a deep-seated investment in architectural language. I remind you that tectonics is not about construction. It's always and only about language. The triglyphs that you see here pointed out on the side of a temple are extended in the front, rendering them either absolutely structurally meaningless or alternatively rendering the very beams meaningless and the ornament absolutely meaningful. This tension between the actuality of structure and the symbolic work at play is at the root of a certain kind of interest that we cannot be innocent of. This same kind of predicament produces amazing conditions. This is Santa Maria della Pace by Brunelleschi that rigorously stacks certain orders in relationship to each other, but then when it comes to the corner, it either forgets or pervertedly swallows the classical orders until they're engulfed in the logic of the corner. Genius or mistake? Could they have just forgotten to put that bay one bay out. Palladio got it right, so how come he got it wrong? This is one level of discourse that I continue to enjoy, which becomes the basis of a lot of the investment we put in detail, not as the result of the development of the project, but actually the precondition for the development of the project. The other historical axis that we're very much invested in is really an empiricism and a speculative spirit that is seen on many fronts, and maybe even more today than any time before. But we've seen it in the catenary experiments of Gaudi, certainly, and experiments are not the same. Even the people we critique in terms of their intellectual bindings have done a significant work on the expressionist front, but I would include Mendelssohn, Polzig, and others in that front. But the architects that essentially interest me are the ones that bring out the tension between these two extreme poles. People like Plechnik, people like Dieste, people like Hugo Herring, Hans Scharoun have always somehow teased out a friction, a productive friction between the figurative and configurative forces of generating architecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nader. We'd like to take some questions now from anybody in the audience. Down at the rear there, Nick. Sorry.
It's just a fast question. How do you deal with local skill and craft, let's say, like with projects that are in China or in Asia, especially when time is so short?
We've dealt with it in two ways. In the Tongxian project, which I did not show today, I sent one of my staff to be part of the local on-site office. And so they lived there and were very much part of the delivery of the project. In Korea, we have a very close working relationship with the client and the local architect who's representing our efforts. And we have Skypes, sometimes daily, sometimes twice or three times a week, until they decided not to call us. The more recent thing with the Korean project, which is, by the way, completely framed. I haven't shown you any of the framing things, but they actually did respect the entire geometry and the framing of the project. But I think my understanding is that Samsung has a policy that when they get everything right, they want to streamline it. So too much communication would have slowed them down. So they want a clean break, actually. Exactly what we don't want, they want, and is being built without us. And I don't know if it's going to be, well, first, I'm not going to argue that's a great piece of architecture. I'll argue for the argument, but I don't know if it'll be that building that I presented. I suspect, though, it will. So a lot of things happen out of a lack of communication as much as they operate out of the willful control of our office. In this case, if they don't give a budget and we are to bleed, we cannot send somebody there. So I'm afraid of that in both China and Korea. In the Korean case, I wouldn't say that we built in much tolerance. And because of that, the system that is the substrate for the cladding on the object above is identical to the substrate of the jig that we put in Bank Restaurant, the plywood restaurant. In other words, it's not the plywood that has to be perfect. It's the jig behind it that has to be perfect, because if that's perfect, everything else is notched right into it. And that's very much the way in which Korea works, albeit with a different tolerance because of the expansion and contraction ratio of steel and aluminum on the skin. But it's tough. In Australia, it's completely different. We are not teamed up with a local architect of record. We are collaborating with a design architect, and their thumbprint in many ways is as much on the project as ours. But they have done extraordinary buildings, John Wardle Architects, and have done amazing buildings, and they're all over the construction administration. So I'm not worried about that at all, in fact. So it varies. But I would say that there's been a huge, an exponential leap from the Tongshen years to the current years, and that was with Skype and WebEx, because the degree to which one can work daily on the same screen as partners, engineers, fabricators, and solve problems in real time have been pretty significant in being able to control projects.
Any other questions?
I got the impression, Nader, that I think you referred to it as 20 years of work, and quite a lot of it didn't seem to have anything to do with the need for a computer. I got that impression, and I just wanted to ask you if that is the case, and how do you deal with that now in the education of the architect as an educator? It's a slightly loaded question, because as somebody who likes technology, one of the problems of trying to create what you're doing is that computers stop us doing that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the question is right on. Essentially, when I graduated from RISD, they got their first Macs, and when I graduated from Harvard, they had just introduced, AutoCAD to the trades the last semester. So effectively, it had no impact on those of us who were already in our thesis years in both places, which effectively means that me and my generation from 1991 onwards were always on the edge of a cliff, always about to be on the verge of obsolescence, because the way in which things were produced was different than the way that we were used to drawing them. It is significant, though, that during our years of 1991 to about 94, 95, we continued to draw by pencil. So the majority of what you saw up there in the beginning, the Casa La Roca, MoMA, I didn't show that today, but MoMA Fabrications was done all by pencil, even though it's completely mass customized. All of the so-called parametrics of Weston and Casa La Roca are done by hand. So they're conceptual parametrics. They're not done by software. But in turn, we were educated then in the reverse order by our students. First in AutoCAD, then in FormZ, then in Rhino, then in, scripting, then in Revit. And they do change the way we work, because they impart different possibilities, different tools, and different power to experiment with different versions of things. So the speed at which things are researched is different. Does it change radically the conceptual project that we undertook 20 years ago? Strangely not, because we were already invested in a series of historical debates and trajectories that remain pertinent today. In that sense, your introduction was, very incisive, is that I wouldn't say we're doing parametrics for parametric's sake. We're just not. For us, that remains a tool, but it's the debates and certain discursive aspects of those dialogues that we're having with other architects that are at stake. And I think it's the architectural contingencies that we're invested in, not everything comes down to form. It's the way in which form engages all of those other things. Part of it also has to do with the dialogue that we create with other people, with structural engineers, with mechanical engineers, with furniture, with the way, with typological variations and ways in which flexibility is induced. In other words, you're constantly in the service of and trying to engage other things. So the computer remains in great part a piece of infrastructure for us, but it would also be innocent if I said it was just a typewriter. No, it makes us work differently. I work differently as a result of it. If you want a even more benign answer, it's a predicament that I have today. I clearly am not able to draw on the computer like any of my collaborators and employees, but I'm almost always dissatisfied with the way that they construct geometries. So I have to go over them and say, no, this is the way it has to be done. Or I'm dissatisfied with the way in which an image is being framed, because there is differences between 1-point, 2-point, and 3-point perspectives, and they're ideological in nature. And it's not just about getting a screenshot. You actually have to be very precise about the optics that go into architecture. So somehow, those people that say, oh, the computer ruined everything and all of that is because they're using the computer in a kind of haphazard, aimless way. But in fact, there are very precise ways in which every command can be unearthed and imparts a series of very precise possibilities. And of course, we are only doing a fraction of that. I mean, you yourself have collaborated on some pretty exemplary projects which have done others. But I mean, I guess to go right to the heart of your answer, the computer has had a huge impact on the means and methods of delivery, but it has not lost sight of a larger longue durée of architectural discourses and debates that have necessarily overridden it. And actually, I enjoy the fact that everything about a computer was about morphology and visualization in the 90s, and not about fabrication, but we were focused on fabrication. Now everything's about parametrics, but we can see it, just it's already past us. Why? Because I sense that there's something far more nuanced about the discipline itself, which is at stake, and we cannot be readily seduced by technique alone.
One question I have picking up on that is, looking at the early work, is clear that many projects develop from a kind of material or component towards a configuration of space, whereas the later work tends to approach it much more from a kind of a sensibility about geometry or its transformation, if you like, towards a more concrete configuration of space. And it's interesting to hear you say that actually the early stuff that was in a sense bottom-up driven was done in an analog means without the use of computer, whereas the introduction of the computer has tended for you to work in a much more, let's say, from geometric to specific, top-down kind of way. And I'm wondering, is that just the scale of the project have got bigger, or is it a strategic thing that you're working remotely, or is it something that actually, in a sense, some of the promise of computing is that as architects, we begin to become engaged in the design of components. We're not just taking industrialized products off the shelf and assembling them, but we are actually deeply engaged in their actual design. Or do you see it having that potential, or do you see it actually pushing us more towards the kind of, let's say, the design thinking model of practice, which actually, in a way, makes us even more irrelevant in the whole process?
Listen, the early projects came with the benefit of either us literally building it with our own hands, or being small enough that the experiments we did with wood, steel, brick could have very concrete and immediate impact on the way that the material is manipulated. So plywood is bent, or folded, or steel is folded, plywood is bent, brick is stacked, and through operations such as, laser cutting sheet steel and bending it on the on the seam versus the core building of brick, we had immediate relationship between geometry and means of assembly. And these are either small houses or installations, and it's a one-step gap between me as the person who's drawing it and how it's being produced. The bigger projects, as you well noted, begin to have a larger, kind of almost more geometric relationship with these things because of two reasons. One, exactly what you said, is that geometry in its stereotomy, if you like, has its own history and its own capacity. So the discovery for me for constructing alliances between a circle and a hexagon or a triangle and a hexagon as part of a transformation was interesting in relationship to typology. Why? Because they align themselves with typology. I don't care what material they are. It's the it's a middle scale operation. It's not about materials. It's about type and geometry. But on the other hand, as we begin to develop some of these buildings through to completion and we go into shop drawings, it goes right back to our origins. In other words, in the Korean project, they thought they could just build it without our jigs. And I said, no, because your metal is going to bend on two axes at the same time, and you're not going to be able to melt it. So you need our geometric work in order that either you're going to fold the aluminum, or you're going to have to flatten it in order that it doesn't have to be folded. But you can't just put it up. You can't improvise this. This is not going to naturally happen. If you have a compound surface underneath it, you're going to have to mitigate how those horizontal louvers are going on. So the material exploration, even when it's threaded through the industry, comes right back to us because it is a rare case where the industry solves those problems for you. Or maybe in Japan they do, but certainly not in America and certainly not in Korea in this case. So I do think that the role that mock-ups have had for us, first, in the old days we used to build big scale models, half-inch scale, which for you is 1 to 20. Then as we began to do larger scale models, we did half scale or third scale models. So the rubber membrane facade of the New England house was, we built a facade this size, and then we built a facade that was 2 stories high, and we let it sit there over the winter to see what the expansion contraction ratio was, and literally upholstered it. And so those were scales at which we could still operate. Now we're doing similar things already for the Korean project, the French project, and the Melbourne project. They're already starting that. So I think it's a different scale, but we're teasing out in a more elemental way. There will be mock-ups, for instance, of Melbourne, of all of these things. And I believe that the design will change as a result of it. In other words, in those areas that we're using plywood, I bet you it's not just a sheet of plywood. I bet you some torque or some seaming will come into it because there will be some geometric give in relationship to how the material behaves. And that remains a core interest that we have. But when you're doing things yourself, you can afford it because you determine your profit. When the contractor does it for you, it has to be in the contract. I want 7 mock-ups. These are the 7 mock-ups, and I want 5 of those mock-ups or something like that. You can't be innocent about that. You have to fight for that.
Any further questions? No? Okay. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
You.